Have you ever judged someone by their uniform, only to discover the soul wearing it could change your entire world? Have you ever glanced past a person cleaning a floor or wiping a window, assuming their story began and ended with the simple task at hand? We all have. We build walls of perception around people, defining them by their function, not their potential. But what happens when one of those invisible people holds a gift so profound, so rare, that it shatters every assumption you've ever made? This is a story about a woman no one saw, and the day she forced the world to look. Lena moved through the gleaming corridors of Aegis Global Security like a ghost. Her uniform was a drab gray, a color that seemed to absorb light and attention, rendering her invisible. Her tools were a mop, a bucket of sudsy water, and a profound silence. She cleaned the scuff marks left by the polished boots of men who carried weapons for a living, men who exuded an aura of confidence and danger. They walked past her, through her, their voices booming with talk of ballistics and threat assessments, never once meeting her eyes. To them, she was part of the building's machinery, no different from the humming air conditioners or the silent surveillance cameras. Her story was written in the tired lines around her eyes, a history of hardship she kept locked away behind a carefully neutral expression. She had fled a war-torn country, a place where survival was a daily negotiation, and the crack of a rifle was as common as birdsong. She worked this job at night and another during the day, sending every spare dollar to a younger sister who was all she had left of a life that had been stolen from her. The men of Aegis saw a janitor. They didn't see the girl who had learned to shoot from her father, not at paper targets, but at the fleeting shadows of those who threatened her family. They didn't see the steely resolve forged in fire and loss. They saw only the mop in her hands. From a darkened observation room overlooking the state-of-the-art firing range, Alistair Finch watched his elite team, with a growing sense of dissatisfaction. His face, etched with the discipline of a lifetime in special forces, was a mask of cold disappointment. He was the founder and CEO of Aegis, a company built on the promise of perfection. What he saw on the range was anything but. The shots were scattered, the groupings loose. There was arrogance in their stance, a casual sloppiness that spoke of complacency. These were the best men money could hire, yet they lacked the one thing he valued above all else, hunger. They had the pedigree, but not the soul of a warrior. His gaze fell on Marco Vance, his head trainer, who was laughing with one of the guards, slapping him on the back after a particularly mediocre round. Vance was a product of the system, all swagger and certifications, a man who believed talent could be quantified by a resume. He saw Vance bark an order at Lena, who had just entered the range to empty the trash bins. Vance didn't even turn his head as he spoke, gesturing dismissively towards a spilled coffee. "Clean that up," Lena simply nodded, her eyes downcast, and went to fetch her supplies. Finch's jaw tightened. It wasn't just the shooting. It was the culture. A rot of arrogance was setting in, and Marco was its most vocal champion. Later that day, Finch called Marco into his minimalist, glass-walled office that overlooked the city. The skyline was a testament to power and ambition, things Finch understood well. "Their performance was unacceptable," Finch began, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the sterile silence of the room. "The client is paying for surgical precision, not weekend hobbyists." Marco shifted in his chair, his confident demeanor faltering slightly under his boss's icy stare. "They're solid, Alistair. Just an off day. We've been running long hours." Finch leaned forward, his eyes like chips of flint. "Don't give me excuses, Marco. Give me excellence. That is the brand. That is the promise." I saw men going through the motions. I saw a lack of focus, a lack of respect for the craft. In our line of work, that lack of respect gets people killed. Marco bristled, his ego wounded. "These are the best men from the best units. Their files speak for themselves." "Files don't stop bullets," Finch countered flatly. "Grit does. Discipline does. I'm not seeing enough of it. I'm seeing men who believe their own reputations. That's the most dangerous enemy of all." The meeting ended on that tense note, leaving Finch with a sour taste in his mouth. He knew Marco wouldn't change. He was too invested in his own methods, too proud to admit the team he'd built was becoming soft. That night, unable to sleep, Finch walked the deserted halls of his company. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of servers and the soft squeak of his own shoes on the polished marble. He was a man adrift in his own empire, frustrated by the very people he paid to uphold its standards. As he passed the firing range, he heard a sound. It wasn't the rhythmic slosh of a mop or the clatter of a janitor's cart. It was a series of soft, metallic clicks. A sound he knew intimately. The sound of a weapon being handled with purpose. He peered through the reinforced glass window. The range was dimly lit by a single service light, casting long, distorted shadows. And there in the center of the vast room was Lena. Her cleaning cart was parked neatly against the wall, her duties for the night clearly finished. But she was not leaving. She stood before one of the shooting stalls, her back to him. She was holding a heavy training pistol, one of the laser-emitting models the team used for drills. It had been carelessly left on the bench. Her posture was transformed. The weary slump of the janitor was gone, replaced by a spine as straight and rigid as a steel rod. Her shoulders were square, her feet planted in a perfect shooter's stance. She raised the weapon, her movements not hesitant or clumsy, but fluid, economical, and breathtakingly precise. She wasn't playing. She was practicing. Finch watched, mesmerized, as she performed a series of dry-fire drills. The sequence was complex, drawing from a non-existent holster, acquiring a target, transitioning to another, reloading an empty magazine with a Phantom 1. Every action was stripped of wasted motion. Her grip was flawless, her trigger discipline immaculate. This was not the muscle memory of a casual enthusiast. This was the ingrained, instinctual grace of a true expert, someone who had spent thousands of hours with a weapon in their hands until it became a part of them. He saw her eyes and in them, a focus so intense it seemed to burn. The world outside her and the target simply ceased to exist. In that moment, she wasn't Lena the janitor. She was a master of her craft. Alistair Finch, a man who had commanded elite soldiers on clandestine missions across the globe, a man who could spot talent from a mile away, felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock. He had walked past this woman every day for 2 years, and had never truly seen her. He had been searching for a spark, for a sign of the hunger and discipline his team had lost. And here it was, in the last place he could have ever imagined. It was hidden beneath a gray uniform, holding a mop and bucket. He finally understood. The problem wasn't his team's skill, it was their vision. And his own had been just as blind. He pushed the door open, the heavy sound echoing in the quiet range. Lena flinched as if struck, the spell instantly broken. The weapon clattered onto the bench. She spun around, her face pale with fear, her body immediately shrinking back into its familiar, apologetic posture. "Mr. Finch. I'm so sorry, sir. I was just cleaning. I saw it was left out. I shouldn't have touched it." Finch walked slowly towards her, his eyes not on the pistol, but on her. He ignored her panicked apologies. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, consuming curiosity. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. Lena stammered, twisting the hem of her uniform. I don't know what you mean, sir." "I was just—" "Don't," Finch interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't lie to me. I've spent my life around people who handle weapons. I've seen rookies and I've seen legends. What I just saw was not the work of a novice. So I will ask you again. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" A shadow passed over Lena's face, a flicker of a pain so deep it seemed to age her in an instant. Her past was a place she never revisited, a locked room in her mind. "A long time ago," she whispered, her eyes finding a spot on the floor. "In another country. It was necessary." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Necessary. Not for sport. Not for competition. For survival. Finch understood. He saw the ghosts in her eyes. But he also saw the extraordinary gift she was trying to keep buried. He knew then what he had to do. It was a risk, a massive, unconventional gamble that would either expose him to ridicule or fundamentally change his company forever. He chose to gamble. The next afternoon, the firing range was crowded and loud. Marco Vance was in his element, his voice echoing with authority as he critiqued his team. Finch stood silently at the back, observing. He waited for a lull, then stepped forward, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "Gentlemen," Finch said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Today, we're going to have a demonstration on the fundamentals of precision marksmanship." Marco smiled, preening slightly. "Of course, sir. Which drill would you like me to run?" "You won't be running it," Finch replied calmly. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Lena, who was quietly wiping down the windows in the far corner, trying to remain invisible. "She will," Finch pointed directly at her. A wave of confusion, then outright disbelief, rippled through the room. The guards exchanged bewildered glances. Marco Vance stared at Finch as if he'd lost his mind, then looked at Lena with pure contempt. A few of the younger guards began to snicker, the sound cruel and sharp in the tense atmosphere. "Sir," Marco said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury and embarrassment. "You can't be serious. This is a highly secure training facility for elite operators." She's the janitor." The word hung in the air, intended as the final, dismissive proof of Finch's absurdity. The snickering grew louder. "She cleans the toilets, sir," one guard muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Another chimed in, "Maybe she's going to show us how to mop up our bad shots." Lena froze, her hand still on the window. Every eye in the room was on her, burning with a mixture of pity, scorn, and amusement. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her first instinct was to flee, to run and hide in the anonymity of her utility closet. She was a ghost, a shadow, she wasn't meant for the spotlight. This was a mistake, a cruel joke. She looked at the faces of the men, their smirks and narrowed eyes. They saw her frayed, cheap uniform. They saw the weariness in her posture. They saw a nobody. They saw exactly what she had been trying to be for years. But then she looked at Mr. Finch. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time: expectation. It wasn't a demand but a challenge. A silent question. "Are you who I think you are?" In that moment, another memory surfaced, pushing past the fear. The memory of her father's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and steady amidst the chaos of their collapsing world. "Your strength is not in your hands, Lena," he had told her. "It is in your focus. Do not let the noise of the world distract you from the one thing that matters." The noise. The laughter and the whispers were just noise. She straightened her back, a subtle shift but a monumental one. She dropped the cleaning rag into her bucket and began to walk towards the shooting stall, her footsteps unervingly steady on the concrete floor. The laughter faltered, replaced by a confused silence. Her movement was so deliberate, so devoid of the fear they expected, that it threw them off balance. She walked past Marco, who looked at her with a mixture of anger and shock. She didn't meet his gaze. She didn't look at anyone. Her world was already beginning to narrow. She reached the stall and stood before the table where a high-end, custom-built rifle lay. It was a weapon of immense power and precision, a tool that cost more than she made in a year. She picked it up. The cold, heavy steel felt alien and yet deeply familiar, like a forgotten language her body still remembered. She checked the chamber, cleared the weapon, and slammed the bolt home with an efficient, practiced motion that made several of the guards blink. There was no hesitation. No fumbling. It was the movement of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. She loaded the magazine, the clicks precise and clean. Taking a deep breath, she settled into her stance, pulling the stock of the rifle firmly into her shoulder. The noise of the room, the mocking eyes, the weight of their judgment, it all began to fade into a distant hum. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Find your center. Let everything else fall away. The world compressed into a tunnel, her vision narrowing until all that existed was the front sight post, the distant paper target, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. She exhaled slowly, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, she fired. The crack of the rifle was explosive, a sharp, clean sound that ripped through the stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were on the monitor above the lane, which showed a digital close-up of the target. A single, perfect hole had appeared, dead center in the bullseye. It was a shot that any one of the men in that room would have been proud to make on their best day. From the janitor, it was an impossibility. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The smirks had vanished from the guards' faces, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Marco Vance's jaw was slack. He stared at the screen, then at Lena, as if trying to reconcile the two realities. He had expected failure, a moment of humiliation that would prove his point and put Finch in his place. He had not expected perfection. A lucky shot, he finally managed to say, his voice strained. He was speaking to himself as much as to the others, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. A complete fluke. It happens. My grandmother could make that shot by accident. The other guards, eager for an explanation that would restore their sense of order, nodded in agreement, murmuring amongst themselves. Yeah, no way she can do that again. Beginner's luck. It's a fluke. They needed it to be a fluke. The alternative, that the woman who cleaned their messes was a better marksman than any of them, was too jarring, too threatening to their professional pride and worldview. They had built their identities on being the best, the elite. Her success was a direct challenge to that identity. Alistair Finch watched them, his expression unreadable. He had seen the shot, but more importantly, he had seen how she took it. The stillness, the focus, the absolute lack of doubt in her movements. That was no accident. He took a step forward, his voice calm but carrying an authority that silenced the murmurs instantly. He looked only at Lena, who had not moved, who was still looking down the sights of the rifle as if in a trance. Again, Finch said. Just one word. It was not a request. It was a command, an affirmation, a challenge to the universe itself. Do it again. Prove them wrong. Prove me right. Lena heard his voice as if from a great distance. The skepticism of the room pressed in on her, a physical weight. A fluke. Beginner's luck. The words were barbs, meant to dismiss her, to put her back in her place. For a second, her focus wavered. The fear threatened to return. Could she do it again? The first shot had been instinct, a muscle memory from a buried life. But a second shot, on command, under this much pressure. That required something more. That required intent. She closed her eyes. The sterile smell of the gun range faded, replaced by the scent of pine needles and damp earth. She was no longer in this gleaming, modern facility. She was a teenager again, hidden in a forest with her father. The targets weren't paper, they were tin cans balanced on a fallen log. He was teaching her about breathing, about how the space between breaths was a moment of perfect stillness. One shot can be luck, he had told her, his voice a gentle rumble. 2 shots in the same place. That is a conversation with the rifle. It means you are listening to each other, a conversation. She opened her eyes. The rifle felt warm in her hands now, not a tool but a partner. She ignored the incredulous stares of Marco and his men. She ignored the weight of their judgment. They didn't matter. The noise didn't matter. She looked through the scope, her vision zeroing in on the tiny black hole she had already made in the center of the target. The challenge wasn't just to hit the bullseye again, it was to erase the evidence of the first shot. It was to achieve a level of precision that bordered on the supernatural. She controlled her breathing, her heartbeat slowing to a steady, powerful rhythm. Inhale. Exhale. The world went silent. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting kick. The sound of the shot was identical to the first, but the silence that followed was entirely different. It was no longer a silence of shock. It was a silence of profound, earth-shattering awe. Every person in the room was staring at the monitor, their breath held. For a few seconds, it looked as if she had missed the target entirely. The screen showed the first hole, but there was no sign of a second. Then the range's high-resolution camera zoomed in, closer, closer, until the image filled the entire screen. The single hole was there, but its edges were slightly frayed, a little wider than before. She hadn't missed. She had fired the second bullet directly through the hole made by the first. It was a one-hole shot, a feat so difficult, requiring such an impossible combination of skill, focus, and environmental perfection, that most seasoned marksmen considered it a myth, a legend told in training camps. And a janitor had just done it in front of them. The room was utterly still. You could have heard a pin drop. The guards looked from the screen to Lena, their faces stripped of all arrogance, all mockery. What they saw now was not a cleaner. They saw something they couldn't comprehend. Marco Vance was ashen-faced. His entire belief system, his carefully constructed hierarchy of skill and pedigree, had been demolished by 2 rounds fired from a rifle held by the woman he considered less than nothing. Alistair Finch walked slowly down the length of the range, his footsteps the only sound. He didn't say a word. He went to the target retrieval system, pressed the button, and waited as the paper target slid back towards him on its track. He unclipped it carefully, holding it as if it were a sacred text. He turned and walked back to the stunned group, holding the target up for everyone to see. A single, ragged hole in the dead center. He looked directly at Marco, his eyes cold with a righteous fury. "You told me your team was the best," Finch said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You told me talent has a uniform and a resume. You told me worth is measured in certifications." He held the target closer to Marco's face. "You were wrong about all of it. You looked at this woman every day, and you never saw a single thing." Marco couldn't speak. He could only stare at the impossible proof in his boss's hand, his career, and his pride unraveling in real time. The other guards avoided his gaze. They looked at Lena, who stood by the bench, the rifle held loosely at her side. She was not triumphant. She was not smiling. She simply looked tired, as if the effort had drained something essential from her. In their eyes, there was no longer mockery. There was only a deep, humbling, and profound respect. That evening, Finch found Lena in her small, cluttered utility closet, packing her things. She was preparing to leave, assuming that after such a display, she would be fired. "You're not leaving," Finch said from the doorway. It wasn't a question. Lena looked up, startled. "Sir, I overstepped." "I apologize, you did not overstep," Finch corrected her. "You revealed who you are. And who you are is the most talented marksman I have ever seen. I'm offering you a job, Lena. Not cleaning windows. I want you to be our new lead marksmanship instructor." Lena stared at him, bewildered. "Instructor? But I'm not a soldier." "I'm not one of them exactly," Finch said, stepping into the small space. "They have become complacent because they believe they have nothing left to learn. You will teach them. You will teach them what true precision is. You will teach them that respect for the weapon, and for the skill, is more important than any medal they've ever earned." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the desire for a better life warring with the ghosts of her past. "I can't," she whispered. "That part of my life. I left it behind. Using a weapon was about staying alive. It was about fear. I don't want to go back to that." Finch's expression softened. "This isn't about going back. It's about moving forward. It's about taking a skill that was born from pain and turning it into a tool for excellence and protection. Your talent doesn't belong in the shadows, Lena. It doesn't deserve to be buried by your past. It deserves to be honored." Just then, Marco Vance appeared at the doorway behind Finch. He looked humbled, his usual arrogance completely gone. He looked at Lena, his eyes filled with a shame that was raw and genuine. "He's right," Marco said quietly. I'm sorry. For everything. For every time I walked past you, for every time I spoke to you without looking at you. I never saw you. Today, you taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Lena looked from the humbled trainer to the hopeful CEO. The apology was not something she needed, but it was something he needed to give. It was the start of a change, not just for her, but for the entire culture of this place. She thought of her sister, of the endless bills, of the constant exhaustion. This was more than a job, it was a lifeline. It was a chance to build a safe, stable life, using the very skill that had saved her once before. She took a deep breath and gave a small, firm nod. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." Months later, the firing range at Aegis Global was a different place. The lazy chatter was gone, replaced by a quiet, intense focus. At its center stood Lena, no longer in a drab gray janitor's uniform, but in the crisp black attire of a lead instructor. She moved with a newfound confidence, her voice calm but commanding, correcting a guard's stance with a gentle touch, explaining the nuance of trigger control with a patience she hadn't known she possessed. The men who had once mocked her now listened to her every word with unwavering respect. They called her "Ma'am." The company's performance metrics soared. Their precision scores were the highest in the industry. They were becoming the elite force Alistair Finch had always envisioned. From the observation room, Finch watched her, a rare, genuine smile on his face. He hadn't just found a new instructor, he had rediscovered the soul of his company. Lena's story reminds us that greatness is often hidden in plain sight, veiled by uniforms of service, humility, and hardship. The most extraordinary people are often the ones we never bother to see, the ones we dismiss because their packaging doesn't match our expectations of their content. We look for heroes in shining armor, but sometimes they stand among us, holding a mop, a serving tray, or a cleaning rag. So the next time you pass by someone you think is invisible, pause for a moment. Look closer. Ask their name. See the person, not the function. Because you might be looking at a master, a virtuoso, a hero in disguise, waiting for just one person to give them a chance to be seen. Share this story if you believe everyone deserves that chance, and remind someone today that their true worth is not defined by their job title, but by the fire they carry inside.